Alright guys, so in today's video we're talking about graffiti. The canvas size that I'm using is 200 by 200, a little bit bigger than the 64 by 64 that we talked about in a previous video if you're a beginner. Also, I'm using a computer mouse. Some of you guys have a tablet, so this may be a little bit easier for you, but I used a computer mouse a lot growing up, learning how to draw in Microsoft Paint. And the technique that I'm about to show you I actually learned in Microsoft Paint. The only benefit that we have here really is all of these tools, but also we have access to layers and how to use layers. And we'll talk about how to use layers in just 1 second. So let's go ahead and get started. So the word that I'm going to be using for my graffiti name, I guess you could call it, is just the word norm, just because it's part of the word normal neighbor. We're just going to elaborate on that. Now, you'll notice that this is pretty loose, pretty sloppy. It's going to look kind of crazy whenever I'm scribbling over top of this. And again, this is the technique that I used to use whenever I was younger. I didn't really do pixel art back then, so it's a little bit different process than maybe what I'm used to whenever I first started doing pixel art. So I'm using the word norm. I'm going to kind of make it pretty readable initially, and then we'll do a couple other styles with a little time lapse at the very end. So starting off with this looks pretty rough, pretty crazy, pretty loose, kind of difficult to read, kind of sloppy. However, we're actually going to use and talk about layers here and how that's going to benefit us. Now down here at the bottom, you'll notice where it says layer, right next to where it says layer there's an eyeball. I can turn that layer on and off. It just means making it visible or invisible. But I'm actually going to go ahead and rename that. There's two ways to rename it. You can either double click on it, so I'm just going to call this sketch, or you can right click on it, click on properties, and you can change the name of it that way as well. So with that done, I'm actually going to create a new layer. By default, going to be called layer 1, and I'm just going to call that letters, just because I want to know that that's the actual official name of this. Now if I scribble on this letters layer, right, I have it selected and I make it visible and invisible, then it's what disappears and reappears. Same thing down here. Literally they're just two pieces of paper stacked on top of each other digitally, and you can take one away and bring the other one back. So I'm actually going to jump into a little time lapse here, kind of process of me working this out, and then we'll come back to this and talk more at length about it towards the end of the process. Okay, so we've reached the end of that process. We have the word that I've chosen here kind of all spelled out, made graffiti-fied, or whatever you want to call it. You can see here, right, with my layers, I have the letters layer. I can make that invisible if I'd like. I make my sketch layer visible again. I can make them both visible at the same time. We can see where we started and then where we ended up. It gives us some freedom to kind of be able to evolve and change that. Also, I know that my letters look a little bit rugged, kind of distorted or warped. That's just the style that I prefer. Everybody has a different style preference, and that's totally fine. So then talking about layers and how this is going to help us a little bit as well is I'm actually going to go ahead and use my bucket tool, and I'm going to fill in around my layers. Now, I made sure that I had a nice solid wall all the way around this. That way, the bucket tool didn't fill in the shape, which if you've messed with pixel art any, you probably have played with that some and understand how that tool works. Then the next tool that we're going to use is one called the wand tool up here on the top right. It's in the same spot where the marquee tool is, which we talked about in a previous video. But I'm going to select the wand tool, and I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to click inside this. Now you'll notice all the space that's not filled in, right? This is white, this is kind of this navy. So this is the only space that's not filled in. So what it's doing is it's selecting colors that are similar to it, which is totally transparent. There's nothing there. I also have gone out of my way to make sure that these things are connected, just because I'm going to show you what I'm going to do with that just in a second. So it's connected here, right? It's connected here. And it kind of just helps with the look that I have. It's connected there as well. We're actually going to use the gradient tool here to kind of put the gradient inside of this. Now over here on the right hand side we have this paint bucket tool. If you click on that, there is a separate option called the gradient tool, and if I click and drag inside this, it'll put a gradient, right? But maybe we don't want it to be red and white like this. We also maybe don't want it to be smooth. Let's talk about some options that we have with that. So over here on the left hand corner where our colors are, we have white and we have red. Let's say I want it to go from green. So I have green selected, and I'm going to right click on the color that I want it to transition to. So if I right click on that yellow, now I have those set up, and if I click and drag, right, you can see it fills that space in. I can click and drag in whatever direction or desired version that I want it to be. Kind of what we ended up with. Obviously it's not totally polished. We have some little bits and pieces that still need to be filled in, but you kind of get the gist of it. Maybe I also don't want this to be such a smooth transition, but we can actually do that as well. With our gradient tool selected, like we had it before, up here where it says no dithering, if I click on that, it says Bayer Matrix 2x2 for, these are just some default options that are hooked into this. So I'm going to click 8x8. I'm going to do the exact same thing that I just did before. Now the only difference is that we have this more pixely look, which I kind of prefer in the overall aesthetic of it. That's kind of what you can do with that. Let's jump into some different styles and kind of see where we land on those as well. the end of the process here. We have our 4 different styles of graffiti. Try to change it up on each one. I think the ones that I'm happiest with are actually the first one and the last one. My favorite one is different, this last one. I personally have a preference more towards abstract things that are not easily readable, but obviously everybody has a different preference in the things that they like. But I do want to show you some things that I left out of the time-lapse, or I didn't describe within the time-lapse because it was moving so quickly whenever I was drawing these other ones out. Actually, it's how to outline around our letters. So if you notice, different than in the time-lapse, I made the background black, and then I have this white outline that goes around the edge of these letters. To do that with my letters layer selected, all that I've done is just hit Shift-O. And whenever I hit Shift-O like this, you'll notice I have this menu that comes up, and I can click OK, and it's outlined it one more. I hit Shift-O again, you'll notice that it keeps doing that. That's the easiest way to outline your letters. Just make sure you have the layers selected that you want to outline. And also, I added a radial gradient in this spot right here. It's more of a round. It kind of just rotating or fading outwards from that. To do that, I went to my gradient tool, right, and then I went up here. Instead of going to linear gradient, which we had been using in the past, I went to radial gradient, and I just clicked and dragged within this, and it creates, kind of a sunspot. But we're at the end of this video. Which one of these is your all's favorite? Do you like number 1, number 2, number 3, or are you in my boat and you end up liking the abstract one more? The reason why I do this video, right, is to show you guys the kind of sketching process that you can do underneath, expose you a little bit to layers if you don't have an understanding of how layers work, but also just to show you what the breadth is possible with pixel art. It doesn't always have to be super pixelated. You can make the style a bit bigger. Again, this was drawn in Aseprite using a mouse. Initially, the canvas size was 200 by 200, but it's expanded out beyond that now as we ventured away from this. But if you liked the video, make sure to like it. If you are still sticking around and you want more stuff like this, then make sure to subscribe to the channel. Anyway, I spent a lot of time running my mouth already. Thank you guys for sticking around, and I'll see you next time.